Hi everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the GeneaVlogger, and on today's vlog, I will be discussing the history behind birth certificates for New York adoptees. Just days ago, on January 15th, 2020, New York adoptees were restored the right to order their pre-adoption birth certificates. For the past 84 years, New York has had laws which has barred adoptees from obtaining their original birth certificate. The way that it works for adoptees in New York is that when they're born, they're given their original birth certificate, but then when they're adopted, they're given a new birth certificate, and the original birth certificate is then locked and sealed. Any attempts by New York adoptees to obtain their original birth certificate were met with an extremely arduous process that was often very costly, quite frustrating, and often it was very humiliating for the people who had to go through it. And even worse, it often was unsuccessful. This new law changes provisions from a law which was passed in 1936 and signed by then New York Governor Herbert Lehman, who actually had 3 adopted children of his own. Notably, this law in 1936 created 2 types of birth certificates that were given to adoptees. The first birth certificate, the original or what's often called the pre-adoption birth certificate, is that which is issued at birth. So it has all of the known information at birth, the actual mother's name, the actual birth date, and so on. But then when that child is adopted, they're given a new birth certificate with different information. And the birth certificate at that point will be sealed from public view and only available through a court order. There's a quite interesting conspiracy that has to deal with this 1936 law that has to do with one of the most notorious child traffickers in U.S. history, Georgia Tann. Georgia Tann was an unassuming woman from Mississippi who ended up in Tennessee running the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Between 1924 and 1950, Georgia Tann stole and sold over 5,000 babies. Georgia Tann would often steal these babies from very poor mothers, often telling those mothers that the baby died and then taking the baby and getting it adopted to somebody else. And Georgia Tann's clients were often very rich and powerful people. One thing that Georgia Tann was known for among her clients was the ability to find children who were the perfect match. Because of this supposed connection between Georgia Tann and Governor Herbert Lehman, it's believed that he signed this law in part to protect himself and to protect Georgia Tann. But based on the facts, this is quite doubtful. The biggest thing is that Governor Herbert Lehman's children were all adopted by 1922. But in 1922, Georgia Tann was actually working in a school. She wasn't working at the Tennessee Home Children's Society yet. Most people say that Georgia Tann started stealing babies and adopting them out in 1924, well after all of the children were already adopted by the governor. But even if he had adopted his children from Georgia Tann, it's very doubtful that he would have even known that they were stolen babies. In fact, it's thought that most of her clients had no idea that any of the children were stolen. The knowledge of what Georgia Tann didn't become public until 1950, just months after she died, during a major investigation to her activities. While the conspiracy is quite interesting, especially since it deals with one of the most notorious child traffickers in history, the actual reality behind the 1936 law is actually quite interesting as well. During that time, a major social issue was the problems that people associated with children who were illegitimate. There was a major social push all around the country right around that time that seemed to want to try to take that stigma away from children who were considered illegitimate. In fact, there were a lot of different articles of people saying that it's not the children that are illegitimate, It's the parents who are illegitimate, so the children should feel no shame. In 1935, the New York House and the New York Senate passed what was known as the Hawley Bills, which were a set of bills which would allow people to put a fictitious name for the father's name if a child was illegitimate. And the idea behind this was that by changing the birth certificate, they could somehow take away that stigma of being illegitimate. But when the Hawley Bills arrived at Governor Herbert Lehman's desk, he vetoed them. And in his statement to the public, he said, "I am in hearty sympathy with the principles and purposes of this legislation. I appreciate what the introducers and sponsors of it intend to accomplish, and I am in accord with the policy which the bill seeks to embody in our law. I believe that the unfortunate children born out of wedlock are entitled to the fullest measure of protection which the state can afford. The motive of removing the stigma of illegitimacy from such children is a most laudable one. I regret, however, that the method by which it is sought to be accomplished in this legislation is unfortunately so defective and would lead to such undesirable results that I am compelled to disapprove the bills." After the governor vetoed these bills, he set up an unofficial committee to look further into the issue and try to determine the best route to help take off the stigma of illegitimacy. This committee consisted of 16 members, and it had a variety of different types of people. There were 3 women on the committee, 3 judges, a doctor, a reverend, various lawyers, government agents, and even professors. The study that the committee conducted lasted for 9 months and involved a lot of different research and questionnaires being sent out to all different states throughout the country, seeking a lot of their ideas as well as looking into their administrative processes to help combat this issue. Through all of this work, the committee then submitted a report to the governor recommending what should be done. From those recommendations, the governor then sent a letter to the legislators saying that they need to draft a bill going along these guidelines because this was the best route possible. And the law that they created was based off of this report. Now, it's very interesting to look at this historical perspective because the law was originally passed in the hopes of protecting these children from illegitimacy. A famous case around that time, which was in the newspapers, was presided over by Judge Judah Goldstein, who was a major proponent for law trying to help the illegitimate children get this stigma away from them. This case had to deal with a young woman who was considered illegitimate. She was married, she had a child, even though she was under 18, and her husband had left her, but she didn't have the $100 so that she could get a divorce and then marry this other gentleman who was ready to wed her and try to support her and the baby. Interestingly, this case was actually being broadcast live over the radio at the time, and during the case, Judge Goldstein talked about how terrible it was that he felt that the stigma of her illegitimacy was part of the reason why she didn't have the $100 to pay for her divorce. And before the case was over, there were supposedly 7 different people who were listening over the radio who had decided to then wire money directly to this woman so that she could get a divorce and then get married to this other gentleman. So at the time, the law was really all about trying to protect these people who had been born illegitimate children and had often grown up destitute in orphanages, and because of that illegitimacy, they were seen as lesser. So their thought was that if we can make it so that these birth certificates are barred from the public, that's going to protect these children. At the time, I'm sure they didn't realize that the law would eventually be interpreted to protect the rights of the parents, and because of that, it would end up causing a lot of problems for the adoptees. And that law would stay on the books from 1936 until November 14th, 2019, when Governor Andrew Cuomo signed S 3419, restoring the right to adoptees over 18. to receive their original birth certificate. Thank you so much for checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. You can also click right about here if you'd like to subscribe. It's completely free to do so. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at GeneaVlogger. I'm the GeneaVlogger. I'll see you in my next video.